This is the self-investigation model, or SIM. Before we talk about the model, let's briefly define self-investigation as exploring the question, who am I? You can come at this from many angles. None of these angles on their own is the whole story, but they all have something to offer. This model looks at 4 of these angles at the same time. This is a cognitive science-based map to explore our sense of self. Why did we do this? Well, it's rare to see these topics pulled together into the same place and see how they relate to each other. We think this is extraordinarily powerful. The second is we're taking tens of hours of books, podcasts, and conversations and distilling them into one short presentation. There are 2 major premises. First, our sense of self and values are programmed early in life, long before we have any choice. In other words, by the time we're fully adults and we truly can appreciate how our lives are structured, we're already well into living them. This is a great irony. The second great irony is that seeing and changing our programming is possible, but it's not totally obvious how. This is a non-intuitive skill that can be strengthened like a muscle. Why care? Well, consider the question, are you living according to someone else's ideals? These ideals could be your parents, your friends, school, community, religion, politics, or culture at large. If you froze your life right now and took everything you understand and could design your sense of self and what you value from scratch, what choices would you make? And further, how could you be confident those choices were truly what you cared about? Second, where is your attention going? Psychologist William James said, "My experience is what I agree to attend to." How much control over our attention do we actually have? Turns out this is very little, but we can change this. Finally, there are links between equanimity, clarity, health, and motivation, and we can understand them. First, we'll make a map of the mind. Second, we'll use this map to see our programming. And finally, we'll use this map to change our programming. Part 1, Map of the Mind. We'll start with a circle just to hold the major components. We'll start with the human brain. We know the human brain has a lot to do with who we are, but we also know the brain does all kinds of things outside of our conscious awareness or control. So it's involved, but doesn't totally explain things. Next, we'll bring in the sense organs, so touch, sight, and sound. And third, we'll bring in consciousness. Consciousness is where we experience everything we experience. It is experience itself. Famously, consciousness is the hard problem. We don't have any idea how it emerges or how exactly it's entangled with the brain, but certainly we are conscious and certainly the brain's involved. So that's what we're representing here. If we peer inside this box of consciousness, we have the field of awareness. Broadly, we have 2 kinds of things or stuff going on in this field of awareness. External stuff, like sights, sounds, touches, and tastes, and internal stuff, like thoughts, memories, feelings, worries, ideas, and goals. It's not like we're focused on all these things simultaneously. Instead, attention behaves somewhat like a spotlight. There are 2 ways of controlling attention. One is this directed attention joystick on the right, and the other is the reflexive attention on the left. Directed is what we choose to focus on. If I ask you to look in front of you and pay attention to the qualities of something in your visual field, you can do that and you will willfully move your attention to your sight. If I say pay attention to what you're listening to, your attention will then move to your auditory field. In a matter of seconds or moments, however, your brain will suddenly go to a memory from yesterday. Maybe something bad or good happened. You didn't choose to do this, you didn't control it, your brain just went right to that memory. Similarly, a few minutes later, you might be feeling anxious about something happening tomorrow. Here too, you didn't choose this, your brain just reflexively moved your attention there. So in short, there are 2 joysticks moving this attention spotlight around. It's somewhat like a battle. You can choose what to pay attention to, but your brain also chooses what to pay attention to. Next, we'll pull in this sense of self. We all have some sense of who we are and what we value. One thing to point out about values is that so many of them are determined early in life, in pre-adolescence. At this point of life, we have twice the gray matter and twice the neurons. We're somewhat like sponges, just running around, soaking up everything we can possibly absorb. Constraints are imposed on us that we don't really understand yet by family or culture. Whatever the constraints happen to be, whatever we're exposed to, eventually solidifies into our sense of self and who we are. It's not that our values or sense of self can't change as adults, it's just that so much of this is formed early in life. Next, we'll talk about the default mode network. The default mode network are regions in the brain that are typically active when we're thinking about ourselves and what we value. Further, there's a time travel component here. The default mode network is active when we're thinking about ourselves and what we value in time. So for example, what do we want tomorrow or 5 years from now? Or what do we regret from yesterday? Next, we'll bring in salience. Earlier, we talked about how directed attention, we can move it around ourselves and the brain moves it around. What is an input to reflexive attention? How does the brain choose what to reflexively pay attention to? Well, there are a few big inputs to this. One is instincts. So we all know this: safety, food, sex, and social status. For any of these reasons. And by the way, salience is what the brain considers important even prior to conscious experience, even before we know the brain is filtering anything out. So, for example, if we're very hungry and we're walking down the street and we smell fragrant food, our brain will direct our attention to that food. The brain understands we're hungry. The brain understands this is a path to take care of that hunger. Again, we didn't control this, it just happened. If we weren't hungry, we might ignore the smell entirely. Another input to salience is novelty. An illustration just came to the screen. Your attention probably went there all by itself, and maybe further went to that red dot specifically. This is just a feature of how the brain pays attention to what's new and interesting. Next, we have pleasure. Generally speaking, the brain, when we find a pleasurable experience, either intentionally or by surprise, the brain will want us to repeat that. As Richard Davidson says here, the brain is organized to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Generally, this is a good thing. However, this is also, it's worth pointing out, this is the basis of addiction. Finally, we have values, circling back to where we started. What we care about, whether these are simple values or complex values, is what we will notice in life, is what our attention will get pulled to. A simple example, if I just became a Jeep owner, suddenly I might start seeing more Jeeps in the world. And it's not that these Jeeps appeared on the road today versus yesterday. It's just that because I'm caring and thinking more about Jeeps, my brain is helping me pay more attention to them. Finally, we'll talk about metacognition. Metacognition, simply defined, is our ability to monitor and control our own mental states. Here's a simple example. I'm going about my day, and suddenly in my attention spotlight is chocolate. There's nothing special about this. I'm thinking about chocolate, maybe how to get that chocolate, when suddenly my metacognition alerts me to the fact that I'm thinking about chocolate. So now I'm not thinking about chocolate, I'm thinking about chocolate. And from here I can do a few things. I might ask questions. Why am I thinking about chocolate? Do I actually value chocolate? I might just go back to what I was doing because chocolate is totally unimportant. Or I might go get the chocolate. The important thing here is that my brain alerted me to the fact that I was thinking about chocolate, and then I have a choice for how I want to direct my attention from there. Another thing to point out about metacognition is much like a skill or muscle, it starts weak and can be developed or strengthened. There's such a thing as metacognitive sensitivity, which we'll come back to later. So this is the map of the mind. In summary, we talked about attention. There's an attention spotlight in this field of awareness. We can direct it, and our brain reflexively moves it around for all these reasons here. We talked about values and how values are so impacted early in life. So earlier we talked about how when we're thinking about ourselves and what we value through time, the default mode network areas of the brain are active. So what happens when the default mode network is inactive and these felt senses go away? To shed light on this, we have Dr. Taylor Guthrie.
But we see, especially this region and some of the other regions that I'll kind of get into that are involved in something called the default mode network, tend to get kind of dysregulated. They tend to be a lot less active when we do things like mushrooms, LSD, when we're in heavy meditation and these, and something, a kind of phenomenon that's described by people from a kind of subjective perspective is this idea of equanimity, of kind of losing a sense of good and bad and pleasant and unpleasant, and kind of just being in the moment, being flooded by kind of the emotional experience or whatever it is. And I think that tracks with what we see from the brain. And it's from kind of a value perspective that we're kind of turning off these top-down models of what I should care about, what I value in this moment.
So why is this significant? Why is it that if we can turn off these sense of self and our sense of values and time, that this is a good thing? Let's pretend for a moment we're a depressed person. We're depressed because of an arbitrary past where we just did not form good values of ourself, a good sense of self and what we value. We look down on ourselves. The future looks bleak. And this is sort of a reinforcing tunnel that we live in. We can't break out of it. We can't imagine anything differently. This is all we've ever known. From that perspective, this, number one, might feel like a relief. But number two, it offers that person a sense of possibilities outside of what they already know. They can say, aha, this sense of self and values I have is actually contributing to my well being or lack of well being. And it's something to start thinking about. So, this default mode network and sense of self, these top down models, as he refers to it, is a power. So, it's not just about shutting them off, it's working with them and making them flexible and positive. And he'll expand on that here.
There needs to be a balance because the default mode network is also the most powerful tool that we have as individuals to actually create the world that we want, because it's what we use to engage in our self-creation and who we are and who we can be, to actively reflect. But it's how it's being used that's the main question, because it also is something that when I'm depressed and I have this version of myself that I'm a worthless person and nothing is ever going to work right and I'm never going to achieve anything, that becomes the model that I'm now ruminating on. And the default mode activity in that moment is more about reaffirming how worthless I am, right? Whereas if I kind of harness the power of it, I can use it for kind of positive, flexible models of myself.
So, how can we harness the power of our self models? How can we make them flexible? We need to start by studying what our models even look like. So, turning down the default mode network and turning down these top down models or sense of self or values is helpful. But then, how do we actually study what we have and change it? We'll look at that next. So, how can we explore these top down models? In other words, our sense of self and what we value. Here to shed light on this again is Taylor Guthrie.
So, can you summarize which cognitive functions you think we need to be aware of and try to quiet versus which ones we could creatively use to our advantage to build an intrinsically motivated identity?
I think attention is key in a lot of these things.
I've come to that that conclusion on my own just in the past month or two.
Yeah. Because it's amazing when you start really, not the controlled attention like I was talking earlier, but the reflexive attention. What are you being pulled towards? And a lot of the times we may think that we have certain values, but what are you actually spending your time paying attention to? What is pulling you? What is kind of distracting you? Because those are the things that your brain considers to be really important.
So there's two things to emphasize that Taylor just said. The question is, how can anybody build their authentic self? Just to back up that comment a bit, what Nate Hagens, the interviewer, means by that is if we've inherited these extrinsic values early in life, meaning the values that have sort of come in from outside and we're building our own, organizing our whole life around these values that aren't really ours, they're not intrinsically motivated. You might call that an unauthentic self. Nate's question is, how can we build an authentic self where these values are deeply important to us? Taylor's answer is to use attention, to pay attention to reflexive attention, right? He said not so much directed attention, but let's watch where our reflexive attention is taking us into this landscape down here. Now, that's a very compelling point. The huge question is, how do we do that? Earlier, we talked about metacognition, and we know that when we're thinking about something, our metacognition will fire up and alert us to the fact that we're thinking about that something. And the thing is, this is a skill that's not intuitive, and it can be trained in strength. And to dive in a bit on that, give it a very quick introduction, is Dr. Brendan Conway Smith.
Now, attentional training, and this fellow, his target of attention is in the triangular area below the nostrils, above the upper lip. You can feel your breath. If you really zoom in, you can notice the feeling of the breath just below your nose. You'll notice it's warmer when you breathe out, and it's cooler when you breathe in. And this is one way of engaging in meditative practice that lowers your metacognitive threshold. As you zoom in on your own physical sensations, you'll notice that your own mental sensations come into clarity. And so the more you zoom in on that area, the more you're able to actually detect thoughts and feelings that you weren't able to detect before.
So there's, again, a couple things here worth pointing out. Number one, just to train our metacognitive threshold. In other words, the amount of times we notice where our attention is. We want to make that strong. We want to strengthen that and increase our ability to actually study our own attention. This is a very simple exercise, Mindfulness 101. you pay attention, in this case, in the area underneath your nose. As you breathe in, you feel the temperature change. As you breathe out, you feel the temperature change. In doing that, you will notice routinely your attention goes away. And what your goal is here is just to bring it right back to the breath whenever you notice this. And this process is strengthening this metacognitive threshold, this metacognitive muscle. It's increasing your ability to notice when your attention wanders away. Now, as you build this muscle, you will start to notice more and more often where your attention is going. And Brendan expands on that further here.
And so this maps on neatly to a first line of treatment that clinical therapists start to realize is most important for helping clients at the beginning. In the beginning, clients will come into their office and they go, I have all these feelings, I have all these thoughts, there's this, I'm concerned people are concerned about me, there's this that happened, and they're just scattered. Their mind is just this whirling dynamo of thoughts and feelings, and they're like in a nightmare. And so their metacognitive threshold is very high. They can't perceive what's going on in their own mind. They're just captive to it, like somebody being in a nightmare. Now, the first thing psychologists will try to get people to do is to gain meta-awareness, to perceive thoughts as thoughts. And as the person starts to build in meta-awareness, they start to see their delirium. They see their thoughts. They go, they're not controlled by it so much. It's like waking up from a dream and remembering the dream, but you're not in the drama anymore. You're not emotionally hooked to what's going on. And so as you're building meta-awareness, you start to create a cognitive distance from your thoughts. Instead of being in the thought, you are separate from your thoughts. There's a cognitive distance. Now you can start to engage with them in a beneficial way. You can move them, you can judge them as beneficial, as real, not real. You can stop them from carrying you away, from building in this sort of rumination and worry that doesn't need to be there. And so developing thoughts as thoughts is one of the benefits of these metacognitive training techniques.
So just to recap that, we can imagine two conditions of metacognition or meta-awareness. Sort of the default condition, when thoughts, feelings, and sensation arise, we just go straight to the reaction. This is the person, in Brendan's words, in delirium. Whatever's arising, they're just sort of hooked on and going with that. As we build this metacognitive muscle of meta-awareness, we can feel our attention drift to these thoughts, feelings, and sensations and just observe them sort of neutrally and at least contemplate them even briefly before we run out into reaction time. So there's a couple points to emphasize. Just to recap quickly, we know attention is the key to study our self-models. We know metacognition is the key to studying attention. And there's two benefits of metacognition. First, you get some idea of where your attention is going, how often it's moved around. That's number one, just an idea of how often it's moved around. Number two, where is it moving to? And number three, when it moves somewhere, you gain this control over engaging with it or not. Those are three powerful things. And again, just to emphasize this is a strength that can be developed. Here, for one final comment on that, is Brendan again.
But it takes time, so it's sort of like going to the gym. Anybody who thinks that they can go to the gym once and then look at themselves in a mirror, you're going to be disappointed. You go to the gym because you know you build up the micro muscles. That'll make you stronger. And over time, over a month, then you go to the gym, you look in the mirror, and you think, oh, actually, I can kind of see the difference now. Same with the meditation practice or attention training practice. You have to respect the data that it works. Decades of data, hundreds and thousands of people and researchers finding out that it works. And so you say, okay, 5 minutes a day, start a timer on your phone, 10 minutes a day. You just do it like going to the gym. And in the long term, you'll notice, actually, I feel like something's different. Something's changed in me. I can perceive things I couldn't perceive before. There's an unhappiness that's not so much there anymore. There are patterns of thinking and feeling that I'm able to actually get a handle on. And yeah, that's exactly what will happen.
So just to recap, first we said, how can we study the self-models? We need to use attention. And specifically, we want to study reflexive attention. We want to see where our mind is going all by itself. To watch reflexive attention, we need metacognition, and we can strengthen metacognition through attention training practice. Committing to this practice is what will give you the insight into what does your brain value. This is essential knowledge to really start the reflection process, which is the last part of this journey. To understand what your brain is on its own caring about and worrying about, that is a key ingredient to this final section, changing your programming, which we'll explore next. So how do we change our programming? Let's just recap how we got here. First, we learned that attention is the key to really understanding our self models. By watching where our reflexive attention goes all day long, we can begin to understand what our brain believes is important, which may be different than what we consciously believe is important. Those are important things to reconcile. Studying this over time gives you a sense of what your brain values. The key to studying reflexive attention is metacognition. We all have a metacognitive threshold. By default, it's set really high, meaning we're more inclined to just go with the attention jerking around all day. Whatever happens to land in the spotlight of attention, we're just going to go running with it, as opposed to being able to stop and realizing we're engaging with the sensation, whatever it happens to be, and we can pause and think about it before we act. It's just basic metacognitive threshold and awareness. With this strong metacognitive capability to study our reflexive attention, we do get a strong sense of what our values are. That brings us to this last piece, which is deciding what's actually important. Before this is not a overnight process. This is the sort of thing that plays out over weeks, months, and years. The small spark you're lighting your fire with is just the ability to be aware of what's going on inside. Just being able to understand this landscape. But then contemplating how to shape it, how do you want to be? These are the long questions that people need to reason with on their own. There are a lot of ways to attack this, and none of these are right or wrong. They're just approaches. Here are some examples. What do you want and why? So as a simple exercise, just study each day what you're actually craving. This could be something very small, like a dessert, or it could be something really ambitious, like a dream job or wealth and fame. Why do you want those things? What are your expectations about them? And are those expectations realistic? It's for each of us to judge on our own, but this is simply a prompt to catch your wants and take them apart and really sit with them. And insight may come from there. Another thing is, what are you attached to? These attachments could be your identity as a employee, or your career success, or your a relationship, or your status as a person, or your wealth, or possessions. What are you attached to? What external things do you feel make you you? Without them, you just wouldn't feel quite like yourself. That's something worth studying. Just understand what you are attached to and why. The next is impermanence. This is just a way of the world. B.J. Miller, Dr. B.J. Miller is a palliative care physician, for instance. He says, invite the lessons of death into your life, and there's a treasure there. What he's, and it's not just human death, it's just the nature of life in general. Everything fades. The universe will fade, the sun will fade, the earth will fade, and then you can get to smaller and smaller time scales. Everything in our lives will go away at some point. It's not to say we should be nihilistic or just not care about things. It's just noticing that and making some sort of peace with it in advance. How do you want to be? Just understanding these things. How do you actually want to be in the world? How do you not want to be in the world? These are just things to think about on an ongoing basis, rather than just being caught in your daily motions and your daily, perhaps habits that have been building for years and decades. Just step out of that and think fresh when you have the chance. How do you want to be? How do you not want to be? One hint offered by Taylor Guthrie is not to change behaviors, but change your identity. A very small example is, if you want to be healthy, you can tell yourself, I have to run tomorrow morning. And that's a small behavior change, but it might fail. Whereas if you think of yourself as a runner, and you think of yourself and how that will affect your health out into the future, it's your self model is more identifying with that running model and all the consequent behaviors that come from that, as opposed to just changing one routine tomorrow morning. You can change how you see yourself as a person. He also notes that intrinsic motivation we seem to have almost limitless energy for. In other words, if we're doing things because the world has more or less told us to do it, then we get tired, and there's only so much we can do to force ourselves through these things. Whereas seemingly, when we're doing things we really care about, there seems to be an infinite well of energy. So that's just worth considering. How many values, how aligned are your daily behaviors with things you deeply care about, and how close can you get to your behaviors overlapping? Philosophy is a great source of contemplation. Here are a few examples. What can we know is true? And how do we know our knowledge is intact? This is a long road. What can we really know to be true? We know we live in a world, unfortunately, where even facts are in dispute. Anybody can make a claim and anybody can make a counterclaim. Consensus reality is all we have to really operate and cooperate in society, but it's very fragile, and we all need to look inside and think hard about what we actually claim to know. We can also think about the nature of ideas. Ideas are just ideas. One example is the idea of money. It's a very powerful idea. It's a very important idea. But if I, go to my bank and I see some numbers, that is just some idea. If I hand you a piece of paper, a $20 bill, and you say, I've just given you value. Well, I've actually just given you a piece of paper. It's because we're all bought in to this collective story of money that's actually powerful. It's not to say ideas are good and bad. It's just that ideas are ideas, and we should treat them as such. That's something to dive deeper on. There's more material on selfinvestigation.org on some of these topics. Finally, is meaning. What is meaning? We might define ourselves by a line with a certain idea of meaning. It might have come from, love or culture or, fate and destiny and, religion possibly. And it's just how true can these things be? Again, this is for each of us to decide for ourselves. But, when we might find ourselves longing for explicit meaning and purpose, and the question is, how true can those things possibly be? Who is the authority of meaning? And ultimately, it's you. So those are some final thoughts. Finally, as anybody embarks upon this journey, as they're exploring this landscape of taking themselves apart and building themselves back up again, community can be a powerful tool. This is a journey. It's a not always a convenient one, and it's a hard one, but it's one that many of us are going through from our own perspectives. So just to do this in some community, this is something also available on selfinvestigation.org. On the homepage, there's a link to a community with a discussion forum where we discuss not just the content of this particular presentation, but many of the ideas that support this journey. Final takeaways. What are your action items? So we just finished up the how to reprogram yourself. If you want to actually leave, step away from this presentation and start doing some action items, where can you start? One is just consider stepping outside of your top-down models. The easiest approach for that is meditation. There are many apps available. As Brendan Conway Smith said, just simply download an app and 5-10 minutes a day, just train your attention and see what happens. That brings us to bullet 2, training metacognition. Not just to step out of your top-down model, as bullet 1 says, but this is now to start doing bullet 3, which is studying your attention and values. By training your metacognition, it's kind of a 1-2 punch. Number 1, you're stepping outside your normal sense of self, and those top-down models. Number 2, you are learning about where your attention's going and what you value. Finally, we're on to reflection. What's actually important to me? This is a long process for someone to digest and really think about for their own. And then finally, you can drop and add values as you see fit. And as we mentioned, community can work quite well as scaffolding as someone goes about this. So with that said, that is the end of this presentation. By all means, if there are any questions whatsoever, please just drop them in the community.